Hello everyone, I'm Marty Pospischil, and this is another Fireside Chat. Today we have a great special guest, Carolynne Maguire with Maguire Company, Notary Public, very experienced, if I can just say,
or old,
well,
just say it, Marty.
Experienced it's a good spin on the many years we've both been in the business.
35 years, right?
35 years. Whoa. We might have to cut that out, but let's continue. Today's topic, very timely, mortgage fraud and how best to prevent it. Now, mortgage fraud, title fraud, there's a few different types of fraud that we're talking about here. And it's really interesting, we're seeing this in the news. I remember reading in the Canadian press in January, there were 32 reported cases of property fraud, and that title fraud now is becoming more common than ever before. And that's really interesting, where criminals are posing as property owners to sell them to receive the ill-gotten gains. Scary stuff. Somebody selling my property. How can that happen? And then mortgage fraud is a different area, and that's been around for a long time. It seems from my research on it. Certainly something that all of us as consumers would like to avoid in either case. And thank you for coming in today and shedding a little bit more light on this scary topic of property fraud. So how common is title and mortgage fraud from your experience, Carolynne?
Well, as you've said, it certainly may seem that we're seeing more of it, but it's still exceedingly rare when you consider the volume of transactions that we deal with. But as rare as it is, it's still scary, just like anything that it could happen to me kind of thing. But I think you'll find that I'd say it's even more rare in BC than Ontario. We have a different land title system. It's a robust near-torrens system that even has built in what's called an assurance fund. It's kind of a mechanism for compensation of victims of title fraud. So we have a different system than Ontario, so they shouldn't be compared apples to apples. But the other aspect of what kind of makes it rare also, depending on the individual who's viewing this, is that not all properties are equal in the eyes of a fraudster.
Right.
So,
right.
Some are a better target, shall we say, than others. So I'd say, as an extreme example, if you're an absentee owner of bare land with no neighbors and no financial encumbrances on your title, there's much less oversight on that title than, shall we say, a couple living in their condominium downtown and lots of neighbors and a mortgage on the title and all kinds of things like that. So you can sort of see how a fraudster would choose the line of least resistance.
Of course, of course.
So if you looked at it by categories, you'd see that some are, obviously far more rare than others. So that's all I can say, really. I mean, it's really just about relative to what is it considered rare.
And it's interesting you touch on that as well, because the cases that were in the media were absentee owners, which is really interesting. And the criminals were posing in one case as tenants in the property and actually went through a real estate company to gain access to the property as the tenant and were entertaining showings, etc. It was amazing that somebody has the ability to do that. And these aren't just off-the-street criminals. They're fairly organized. These are sophisticated groups that seem to be involved in this. And it takes a lot of hoops to jump through to actually get to that point. But before we sort of get into more detail, there's two types of fraud that we're talking about. There's title fraud, and then there's mortgage fraud. Why don't we chat a little bit about each of those separately?
It's much like it sounds. It just depends what the real target of the fraud is. In other words, where are those ill-gotten gains coming from? So title fraud would have to do with, forging, ownership papers, whereas a mortgage fraud, though it can sometimes relate to forged ownership papers, means that the lender isn't perhaps dealing with the correct person as the borrower. So somebody's forging something that results in a mortgage being advanced, and then those funds have disappeared.
Right, with the wrong individual.
Exactly.
Yes,
so whether it's sale proceeds or mortgage proceeds.
Right. So that, and as an aside, I also remember reading, and I think it was a little bit older data, maybe 2018, 2019, the breakdown, as you mentioned, between the provinces, property fraud is more prevalent in Ontario compared to BC. And actually the percentage I saw was like 67% in Ontario and 12% in BC.
Okay, well, you've got stats to back that up. I'm impressed.
We're a little safer here, a little bit.
I know in concept that that's true, but thank you for having the numbers on that.
It's kind of interesting to see that breakdown, and like you say, we have a more robust system here in BC because we're better. Sorry, Ontarians. But that is kind of an aside, and as you talked about, there's different scenarios. There's absentee landlords where the neighbors may not have ever met the owners and don't know if they have tenants, and they're maybe more of a target in this than somebody who's living in the home. They're occupying, people are around, they're involved with their neighbors. All of that can help tremendously, and I think that's how one of the parties got caught. Here's a good question that I have always been wondering. When this happens, as rare as it is, let's talk a little bit with our limited exposure to this as well. Who bears the cost? Right?
Big question, great question, and one of those questions that can only be answered, it depends. So
right.
Obviously the fact pattern, will be the one that decides, but even with similar fact patterns, appeal courts have had to deal with this, so even judges can't agree.
Right.
So it depends on the situation. We could maybe discuss a few examples that might give people sort of reason to ponder these kinds of things.
Right.
So let's start with a situation where the fraudster has forged the transfer document, and an innocent third party is the buyer.
Right.
So they've poured their hopes and dreams into this property. They're excited about it. It happens to be bare land, but that's okay because they have plans to develop it. Now we're going to develop it. We put a mortgage on it. We're living happily ever after.
Everything's great.
Everything's great. And then
the owner shows up.
The actual real owner shows up and says, "What the heck?
What are you doing in my house?
Well, why did you build a house on my land?"
Oh, well, exactly.
Anyway, so, and of course, these are all expecting the fraudster now is in the wind.
They're gone.
They're gone. They're not a recourse there. But
yeah.
And anyway, so now who gets what? Okay. Well, because the buyer was an innocent, that's the key. Then they relied on our system, and as such, they should be protected under it and can continue to be the owner of that property.
Interesting.
And because they were the correct owner of the property, the mortgage people are safe because they lent it to the right person. But the
poor seller.
Well, not seller, but defrauded owner.
Owner, yes.
Yes. She person would have to make a claim against the assurance fund.
Okay. And that's what we have in BC.
And that's what we have in BC.
Correct.
So I'm not saying it's an easy process, but that would be, the concept.
Right.
Okay.
Right.
So now let's compare that with a situation similar, but now what's happened is that the fraudster has an accomplice, and the accomplice is the one who was the buyer. So we've forged the transfer papers to our friend, and our friend then puts a mortgage on the property. Okay.
Right.
And we all make, the two of us, we make off with the mortgage proceeds. Okay, so we're in the wind. We don't care about the property.
Right.
We just wanted the mortgage money.
Right, of course.
Okay, so off we go. All right, so who's left holding that bag? Okay, so we've got a situation where the original owner, who comes back and discovers this mess, because the person who bought it wasn't innocent, they were an accomplice,
Mm-hmm.
it would likely be that the owner's ownership would be restored
Mm-hmm.
with no mortgage on it. In other words, put it back the way it was before the fraudsters came along.
The bank.
But the bank,
The poor bank.
the poor bank.
Yeah.
Not too many people use poor bank.
No,
in
it
the same
doesn't really go
sentence.
together.
An oxymoron,
I'm
but-
stumbling on that phrase, but the bank is
But yes.
caught holding the bank.
That's
Yeah,
right.
Yeah.
So they are the ones out of luck.
Right.
But if it were, for example, another situation where the title is perfectly fine, nobody's changing the ownership at all, okay? The owner still owns the property.
Mm-hmm.
But a fraudster comes along and just goes to the bank and pretends to be the owner
Right.
and borrows some money
Okay.
and takes it and leaves.
Mm-hmm.
And the correct owner of the property starts getting hate mail from the bank about why their payments aren't being made. That's when this is discovered.
Right.
Okay, so there's been no loss of ownership of the property,
Mm-hmm.
but now the owner has a mortgage on the title, on their title, that they didn't have before, and they've got an angry bank. Well, it would likely be that the bank is out of those proceeds because they dealt with a fraudster,
Right.
but the owner doesn't get off scot-free because now they have to bear the cost of they have now the responsibility of clearing that title off. In other words, it's, even though it was not their fault, they still have a job to do to clean up their title.
Makes sense. And this is out of the scope of the title assurance fund because no title change has taken place, correct?
Yeah, the assurance fund doesn't pertain to charges on the title.
Fair enough.
Yeah.
On the assurance fund, a question popped into my head. Is there a limit to the assurance fund? Do you
That's
know
a great
of?
question. I must admit,
I don't know.
checked on that.
Okay.
I don't know how deep their pockets are.
Okay. We'll
Good
try
one
and
to
get a
find
link
out.
on the bottom
Yeah,
with respect to
the
that.
LTSA, Land Title Survey Authority,
Got it.
might be a good resource for that.
Excellent, excellent. All these things start popping into my
Yeah,
head. I'm
so-
getting a little nervous.
so
I
you
should
see-
run home right now and just make sure everything's okay.
I'm sure there's enough oversight on your.
My wife is there.
There you
I
go.
think she has oversight over everything, right? Okay. Now here's the important question that I'm sure a lot of you are wondering. What can I do as a homeowner, whether I'm an owner-occupier or an investor, whether I live here or I'm absentee? What can we do to protect our title, our property, for mortgage fraud or title fraud?
Yeah. There's only one way I know where you could effectively prevent it,
Okay?
but it's not available to everyone.
Okay?
If you have a clear title, you can request that the Land Title Office issue a duplicate indefeasible title
Mm-hmm.
to you.
Mm-hmm.
It's a piece of paper
Mm-hmm.
that you must never lose.
Ever.
Ever,
It's like
ever.
the deed in the U.S.
Kinda.
Yeah.
Yeah. So this would go right into the safety deposit box or somewhere that you absolutely will protect it and know where it is when you need it. Because by holding this, you have effectively frozen your title. There cannot be transactions, either changes of ownership or charges placed on that title
Right.
while you hold it. So if you want to transact on it, you have to be able to return it to the Land Title Office.
For any changes to be
Yeah,
made.
so you want to
Fascinating,
list and
yeah.
sell your property, you better be able to hand that document into your conveyancing professional.
Right. And that's that little line in your title, duplicate indefeasible title. Yes,
Issued
no?
to and
yes,
on a date.
Right.
That's right.
Interesting. Now, I remember 30 plus years ago when I entered the industry, the advice was to never, ever, ever get out a duplicate indefeasible title.
That's because
If you lose it, you're hooped.
Exactly.
You're hooped.
There's a risk associated with that.
Right.
So, it's not a decision that everyone would make because it's a responsibility.
Right.
It's not that it can't be replaced, but the process is onerous and costly. So,
Of course.
and not quick.
Not quick.
So that's the sort of thing where you make a choice. Do I trust myself to know where to find this? It's kind of, are you someone who feels comfortable having, the keys to your cryptocurrency?
Right.
Yes.
Oh,
So-
that's another fireside chat. Cryptocurrency.
In other words, do you trust yourself? Can you be responsible for
Right.
this? Yes. But that is the way that you can prevent activity on your title.
Right.
Anything else is about, sort of management or mitigation.
Sure. Yeah. And that brings up the question, title insurance. Does
Yeah.
that play a role here? What does that look like?
It can, absolutely.
Okay.
And lenders love it because, as you heard from our examples, lenders are often the ones out of the money.
Yes.
And title insurance will reimburse them. So
Okay.
that's great.
Okay.
What's important to know is that a lender policy is not the same as an owner policy.
Fair. Makes sense.
Yeah. So sometimes people have paid at the time of their conveyance for title insurance because their lender required it. And they may have been given the option for owner coverage. And at that point, if they decline it, that means that anything that happens is not covered for the owner, only for the lender.
Makes sense.
Okay. So if you want coverage against fraud, whether be it title or mortgage fraud, from a title insurance company, it's a one-time premium for as long as you own the property, and it's based on the value of your property.
Okay.
So it's
certain
a risk,
percentage of the
yeah,
value.
it's a
Okay.
risk tolerance decision.
Right.
People have to decide, well, how much do I know about this property? How vulnerable do I feel? What is my risk tolerance? How long am I going to own this property? What is the premium? All of those are factors in that decision, but the key is to make sure you understand that it's not one policy for both. It's ownership and lender coverage are separate.
Separate.
Yeah.
They separate them out in the title
right.
insurance. Certainly something worth looking into if this is a concern of yours in a property that you own, whether you're in it or not, whether to purchase title insurance.
Yeah. And typically that comes up at the conveyance.
Right.
Certainly would in our office. But whether or not, what your sort of ability to buy title insurance, what its costs are and what have you, and the different providers, once you are a long-time owner of the property, then it's a different
Fair enough.
question.
And I can
you
do
know
that.
more about it.
And I can do that whether or not I have an existing mortgage on the property or not. I can do that now after I've owned the property.
Yeah, I
for
mean, it's the sort of
some
thing
time.
where you'd inquire. I'm not an agent for any
Right.
title insurance company. We facilitate the ordering process at conveyance.
Right.
But there are individual providers, 3 or 4 competitors in the marketplace, that you could research that
Yeah.
with. Yeah.
Yeah, worth looking into.
The only other thing you can do really is just try to make yourself less of a target,
Right.
right? So if you, for example, have a clear title, a lot of lenders would be happy to put a mortgage on your title to secure perhaps a line of credit. A lot of providers have home equity line of credit, secured line of credit. Every bank's got a product that they could offer you. It still is a mortgage, though, and a lot of people misunderstand this. It's not just a line of credit. For some reason, the banks don't use the M word, but it is a mortgage on your title, and that's the benefit in this case, is to have a disincentive to a fraudster.
Right.
You can keep a zero balance on it. You don't have to owe money.
But it's
to
a
have
charge on
But
title.
it's a charge on the title.
Right.
And it gives you a rainy day fund to access if you need it.
Of course.
But it's not for everyone. So this is what I mean. When you have a clear title, you could choose to do that, or you could choose to get the duplicate out.
Right.
So with a clear title, you have more options, but you're also more vulnerable until you
course.
make a choice.
Yes, absolutely. And a lot of the fraudsters start with, of course, they must, identity theft. And this comes back to, I'm super paranoid about identity theft. I have a shredder at home, and anything that comes in the mail with my name on it gets shredded. I also joined a service provider called Equifax, and they monitor my name, my bank accounts, or my credit cards, etc. And if there's anything out of the ordinary, or any kind of application comes up with my name on it, I get a notification.
That's great.
And I pay annually for that, and my wife, my daughter, they're all on that system. That's another thing that you might consider. There's other companies that do that, looking into identity theft. Companies who will protect your identity or at least notify you when anything comes up. So there's lots of things we can do. And as a realtor, when we're doing a transaction, it's really important as your realtor for us to make sure you are you. Or if we have a buyer who is selling your property without you knowing, we need to check identification properly.
And identification is checked at so many stages in British Columbia.
Yeah.
Whether it's absolutely you would, mortgage professionals,
Right.
banks, notaries, lawyers,
Yeah.
we're all checking that ID.
Yeah.
And yes, there's some pretty sophisticated
It's
identification, forgeries out there.
right.
But, you can only do what you can do within the system that we're given. But at least we've got a lot of vigilance in our system.
Right. And you know what's interesting on if it's a forged identification, some of them are you would not know. I wouldn't know. And it's very difficult to determine if the identification you're looking at is authentic. It must be photo ID. We don't obviously use credit cards or memberships to Costco or
Government
anything
issued,
like that.
yeah.
Government issued identification. And something else that we do here at Pospischil Realty Group as well is when we're doing a transaction for a purchaser, I think it's really important to do an extra step. Look them up in the socials. Make sure that the photo of or the person you met with is
Brilliant.
actually the same person that you're seeing in the social.
Yeah.
Because you'll be surprised. I believe there was one case that I read about where it didn't match, and it was brought to the attention of a mortgage lender, and the lender actually caught them. So it was very interesting to go that little bit extra step, as I know you do and we do, to ensure that the person you're dealing with is actually the person they're saying they are. And it happens so rarely. So
It is still very rare.
it's very rare.
But in many cases, to the credit of someone like yourself.
Well, thank you. And FinTrack, of course. We're filling out all those forms.
Exactly.
And getting the IDs.
There's a lot of vigilance
There's
in our system.
So, and that's why these fraudsters, I like that term, fraudsters, are not your average criminal. They're typically quite sophisticated. They're usually working in a group because there are so many hoops to go through to actually carry this out. But they're bad people.
And you know what? Some of those bad people make it their mission to get through, to run that gauntlet and to just...
Right. But they're not weighing, karma into this. Right? Because
That's right.
Right? The universal rule that everything comes back to you one way or the other, I think is the ultimate risk that they're taking. If you don't mind me saying, if they're not caught to the very end, something will happen.
Yeah, absolutely. So karma aside, though, we've got the best system that we can have, I think, in BC.
Excellent.
And, and you're absolutely right. Working with skilled and experienced professionals
Key.
is another way, to keep fraud, from your door.
Absolutely. Absolutely. Great discussion. Very interesting topic. I hope that sheds some light on it for everyone. Thanks, Carolynne.
Oh, thank you, Marty.
Yeah, I really appreciate you coming by, and I hope you guys enjoyed that. Any questions? I've got Carolynne's contact information behind me. Feel free to email me. We're more than happy to answer any questions on our topic today. And again, thanks for joining us.
Thank you.